There comes a moment in every warrior's life when the battles outside become less important than protecting what waits at home. For Stigr the Giant, that moment arrived on a cold winter night when he returned from 3 months of raiding, expecting to find his longhouse empty and quiet. Instead, he found Brynja, his loyal servant, waiting by the fire. Before he could speak, she pressed her hand to his lips and whispered urgently, "Do not speak. Hide." His own home was no longer safe. A rival clan had come to take everything, believing the great warrior was still across the sea. But they hadn't counted on one thing: the woman who had been protecting his hall alone, and the quiet love neither of them had dared to name. But what threat could make the most feared warrior of the North hide in his own home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver brooch at Brynja's throat caught the firelight as she moved through the longhouse that autumn morning, 3 months before Stigr's unexpected return. The delicate piece bore the mark of noble birth. Intertwined ravens worked in precious metal, yet here she was, tending the hearth of a warrior's hall like any common servant. But those who knew her story understood that Brynja served by choice, not circumstance. "The ships are ready, my lord," old Einar announced from the doorway, his weathered hands gripping a walking staff carved from driftwood. The grizzled retainer had served Stigr's father before him, and his loyalty ran deeper than the fjords themselves. "The men await your word." Stigr emerged from the sleeping alcove, his massive frame filling the space like a mountain given human form. At 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that could carry a full-grown ox, he had earned his name through more than just height. His beard, braided with small silver rings, spoke of victories in distant lands, while the scars along his forearms told stories of battles that lesser men would not have survived. "The weather?" Stigr asked, pulling on his mail shirt with practiced ease. "Fair winds for the crossing," Einar replied. "The Saxon coast will be ripe for taking. Their harvest is finished, their storehouses full." Brynja moved quietly around them, preparing bread and dried meat for the journey. Her movements held a grace that spoke of careful upbringing, her speech refined despite her humble position. She had come to Stigr's household 5 years ago, when her father's lands were lost to debt and her family's honor required a quiet exile, rather than accept marriage to a cruel lord who would clear those debts. She had chosen service in the house of a man known for his fair treatment of those under his protection. "The young ones grow restless," Stigr observed, watching through the open door as his warriors loaded the longships. "Olaf's son speaks too loudly of the gold we'll take." "Youth always speaks loudly," Einar chuckled. "I remember when you could barely lift a sword, yet talked of conquering all of England." Brynja smiled at this, remembering her own first days here when she had expected to find a savage berserker, only to discover a man who read the old stories by firelight and spoke gently to children. The contrast between Stigr's fearsome reputation and his quiet nature had surprised many, but none more than herself. "The household will need careful tending while we're gone," Stigr said, his gray eyes finding Brynja's. "The harvest stores, the livestock, the repairs to the eastern wall. All will be as you left it," she replied, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. 3 months seemed an eternity. Carrie, the young thrall girl who helped with the cooking, burst through the door with her usual boundless energy. At 15, she possessed the restless spirit of youth and an unfortunate tendency to speak without thinking. "The ships look magnificent, my lord, like great sea dragons ready to devour the Saxon coast." Stigr's laugh rumbled through the hall. "Perhaps save such poetry for the skalds, little one. We go for provisions and trade goods, not to devour anyone." But they all knew the truth. Raids were dangerous business, and not all who sailed would return. The Saxon coast was well defended, their soldiers experienced in fighting Norse raiders. Each expedition was a gamble with fate itself. Einar, see that the men understand we strike quickly and withdraw. No unnecessary risks, no heroic foolishness. Stigr's voice carried the authority of years of command. Better to return with modest gains than not return at all. The old retainer nodded sagely. I'll remind them that dead heroes enjoy no meat in their own halls. As the morning progressed, the longhouse filled with the controlled chaos of departure. Warriors checked their weapons one final time, while their families offered quiet prayers to the gods. The smell of leather and oiled steel mingled with the wood smoke and cooking fires. Brynja found herself memorizing details, the way Stigr tested the edge of his great axe, the careful manner in which he wound his arm rings, the methodical checking of his equipment. She had watched this ritual many times, yet something felt different today. "You seem troubled," Stigr observed, approaching where she stood sorting supplies. "Not troubled, my lord. Simply mindful of the season. Winter comes early this year. See how the ravens gather." He followed her gaze to the large black birds roosting on the hall's peaked roof. In the old ways, ravens were Odin's messengers, and their behavior often portended change. "Ravens gather every autumn," he said gently, but his eyes lingered on the birds with new attention. "Yes, but not in such numbers, and not so silent." She was right. The usual raucous calling was absent today, replaced by an odd, watchful quiet. The truth was, Brynja had been troubled by dreams for the past fortnight. Visions of empty halls and cold hearths, of strangers walking through familiar rooms. She was not given to superstition, yet the dreams felt too vivid to dismiss entirely. "Perhaps the gods grow tired of our constant noise," Stigr suggested with a smile. "Even ravens need peace sometimes." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thorvald, Stigr's second-in-command. A solid man with arms like tree trunks and a practical mind for tactics, he served as the perfect complement to Stigr's sometimes overly cautious nature. "The tide turns within the hour," he announced. "The men grow eager to catch the morning wind." Stigr nodded, then turned back to Brynja. "Remember, if Jarl Grimvir's men come sniffing around, tell them we've gone fishing in the northern waters. Let them think us poor fishermen rather than successful raiders." Grimvir Bloodaxe ruled the neighboring territory with an iron fist and envious eyes. His own raids had yielded poorly in recent years, while Stigr's careful planning and measured approach had brought consistent prosperity to Vargheim. The rivalry had grown from mere competition to something approaching genuine hostility. His spies had been seen near the eastern boundaries, Einar warned. Bold as brass, they were, counting our livestock and noting our defenses. "All the more reason for discretion," Stigr replied. "What he doesn't know of our movements, he cannot use against us." The wisdom of this would prove prophetic in ways none of them could foresee as the time for departure arrived. The household gathered in the main hall for the traditional blessing. Stigr stood before the carved wooden altar where small statues of the gods watched over his family's fortunes. Thor's hammer, Odin's ravens. Freyr's golden boar. Each deity represented different aspects of the protection they sought. "May Thor's strength guard our axes," Stigr intoned, following the ancient words. "May Odin's wisdom guide our choices. May Freyr's abundance fill our ships." "May you return with honor," Brynja replied, speaking for the household. "May the sea roads be kind and the winds favor your passage." The formal ceremony complete, Stigr approached her for the personal farewell. In the presence of others, this would be restrained. A warrior did not show weakness, even before those he trusted most. Yet his hand briefly covered hers where it rested on the silver brooch. "Keep this house safe," he said quietly. "Keep yourself safe. Both will be here when you return," she promised, hoping her voice did not betray the sudden fear that gripped her heart. Young. Carrie wept openly as the men filed out toward the waiting ships. But Brynja maintained her composure until the last warrior had passed through the door. Only then, with just Einar beside her, did she allow herself to watch from the doorway as the longships caught the morning wind. "He'll return," the old retainer said gently. "I've sailed with 3 generations of his family. They all come home eventually." "Eventually," Brynja repeated, the word heavy with all the uncertainty it contained. The ships grew smaller against the gray horizon until they vanished entirely, swallowed by the vastness of the northern sea. The longhouse felt hollow without the presence of 20 warriors, their voices, their energy, their constant motion. Even the dogs seemed subdued, as if sensing the change in their small world. "Well then," Einar said with forced cheer, "I suppose we'd better see to those eastern wall repairs. Winter waits for no one, and neither does necessary work." Brynja nodded, grateful for the distraction. Work would help pass the days until Stigr's return. Work would keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. Work would prevent her from dwelling on dreams of empty halls and the gathering ravens that seemed to watch everything with unusual interest. As she turned back into the house, her fingers unconsciously touched the silver brooch at her throat. A gift from her mother on her 16th birthday. It had survived the loss of land, status, and family. It would survive this separation, too, along with the feelings she had never dared speak aloud. 3 months seemed like a lifetime, but she would wait. She would keep the house safe, as promised. And when the ships appeared again on the horizon, she would be here to welcome home the man who had become far more than her lord, though neither of them had yet found the courage to acknowledge what everyone else in the household had long since understood. The Iron Raven's standard thrust into the packed earth of his courtyard told Stigr everything he needed to know. Clan Bloodaxe had come not as visitors, but as conquerors. The black metal bird perched atop its pole like death itself, its wings spread wide in mockery of his own. Carved wooden ravens that adorned the longhouse roof. From his hiding place behind the grain storage, Stigr watched his hall burn with the light of an unwelcome fire. Rough voices carried on the wind, speaking his language but with the harsh accent of the southern territories. Grimvir's men had made themselves comfortable in his absence, and their confidence suggested they planned to stay. How many? He whispered to Brynja, who crouched beside him in the shadows. 12 inside the hall, she breathed back. 2 more watching the road. They arrived 5 days ago, claiming you had granted them shelter for the winter. The audacity of it struck him like a physical blow. Not only had Grimvir's warriors invaded his lands, but they had done so under the pretense of invitation. Anyone challenging them would appear to be breaking the sacred laws of hospitality, a crime that would turn other clans against him. "They know you're supposed to return soon," Brynja continued, her voice barely audible. "I told them you had sailed north to the fishing grounds, but Grimvir himself arrives tomorrow for what he calls a celebration." "What manner of celebration?" Her pause told him everything before her words confirmed his worst fears. "A wedding. He claims you promised him my hand in marriage as payment for a debt." Rage flared in Stigr's chest like dragonfire. No such debt existed. Grimvir had invented the entire story to give his theft the appearance of legitimacy. Worse, by claiming Brynja as bride price, he would gain legal claim not just to her, but to the property she managed. In one stroke, the cunning Jarl would acquire Stigr's lands, livestock, and stored wealth. "The others know this is false?" he asked. Einar protests daily, but they laugh at him. They say an old man's memory cannot be trusted, and who would believe the word of servants over a Jarl's sworn oath? Through a gap in the storage building's wall, Stigr could see into his own hall. Grimvir's warriors lounged at his high table, drinking his mead and gnawing his winter stores. Their weapons leaned casually against the carved pillars that his grandfather had raised, and their travel packs lay scattered across the floor. Where his family's shields once hung in honor, one of the invaders, a scarred brute. with arms like tree trunks, had claimed Stigr's own high seat. The massive chair, carved from a single oak and inlaid with silver, had been the place of honor for 3 generations of his family. To see it occupied by a stranger felt like watching his ancestors' graves be defiled. "That one is Ulf Ironhand," Brynja said, following his gaze. "Grimvir's champion. He speaks of the wedding as if it were already accomplished, and boasts of the children he will sire on Jarl Grimvir's new lands." "My lands," Stigr growled. "Not according to him. He claims you forfeited all rights when you failed to honor your marriage contract. By tomorrow night, everything you own will belong to Clan Bloodaxe." The legal trap was masterfully constructed. Without witnesses to contradict Grimvir's story, Stigr would appear to be an oathbreaker trying to escape his obligations. Even if he could prove his innocence, the process would take months' time Grimvir would use to consolidate his hold on the territory. "Where are the others?" Stigr asked. "Einar, Carrie, the farmhands?" "Confined to the servants' quarters. They're not prisoners exactly, but armed men watch them constantly. Ulf claims it's for their own protection, to prevent them from fleeing their new lord's service." New lord. The words tasted like ash in Stigr's mouth. Everything his family had built, everything they had fought to preserve, would be swept away by one man's greed and cunning. "How have you avoided confinement?" "I told them I needed to prepare for the wedding cleaning, cooking, making ready for Grimvir's arrival. They see me as a useful tool, nothing more." But Stigr saw the truth in their careful movements, the way her eyes constantly tracked the positions of their enemies. Brynja had not been simply cleaning and cooking these past days. She had been gathering intelligence, learning their routines, searching for weaknesses. The silver brooch at her throat caught the moonlight as she turned, and he realized she had positioned herself as the key to any resistance. "They trust you completely? They think me a helpless woman, grateful for the protection of strong men. Ulf suggested I should thank the gods for delivering me from service to a weak lord who abandons his people for months at a time. You've maintained the deception well. Years of managing your household taught me to listen more than I speak. Men who mistake quiet observation for timid acceptance often reveal more than they intend." A sound from the hall made them both freeze. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor, followed by the scrape of a chair and the slosh of liquid poured from a jug. Someone had risen for a late drink, nothing more, but the reminder of their precarious position sent ice through Stigr's veins. "The main force arrives tomorrow?" he whispered. "At midday. Grimvir brings 20 more warriors for the ceremony, plus his own household servants to establish permanent residence. By tomorrow night, 40 armed men will hold your lands. 40 against 1. Even for a warrior of Stigr's reputation, such odds were impossible. Yet surrender meant watching everything he valued disappear into Grimvir's greedy hands. It meant abandoning the people who had served his family faithfully, leaving them at the mercy of a Jarl known for his cruelty, most unbearable of all. It meant losing Brynja to a marriage that would destroy her as surely as a blade through the heart. "There has to be another way," he said, though his mind struggled to find it. "Perhaps there is." Her voice held a note of careful hope. "They don't know you've returned. Grimvir expects to find an empty hall and a compliant bride. If we can turn their confidence against them, what do you propose?" "Let them believe they've won completely. Let Grimvir arrive to find everything exactly as he expects, except for one thing he cannot anticipate, which is you." The plan began to form between them, whispered in fragments as they moved carefully around the occupied buildings. Brynja would continue her role as the helpless bride-to-be, ensuring Grimvir's men remained relaxed and overconfident. Meanwhile, Stigr would use the network of hidden passages his grandfather had built into the compound's foundation's roots known only to family members and the most trusted servants. "The ceremony will take place in the hall," Brynja explained. Grimver will want witnesses to make it legally binding. Every warrior will be present to show clan strength, leaving the rest of the compound lightly guarded, or unguarded entirely. Their arrogance works in our favor. They truly believe there's nothing to fear from an absent lord. As they spoke, the iron raven standard caught the wind and swiveled on its pole, the metal bird's cold eyes seeming to sweep across the courtyard like a living thing. Tomorrow, that symbol of Clan Bloodaxe would preside over what Grimver intended as his final victory. But symbols could be torn down as easily as they were raised. And even the cleverest trap could become a prison for its creator. The wedding Grimver planned as his triumph might instead become his downfall if one loyal woman and one determined warrior could find the courage to risk everything on a desperate gamble. "Are you certain you want to do this?" Stigr asked, seeing the full weight of danger in her plan. Brynja's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers strong despite their delicate appearance. The silver brooch at her throat caught starlight as she lifted her chin with quiet determination. "This is my home too," she said simply. "I will not surrender it without a fight." In that moment, standing in the shadow of his stolen hall with enemies sleeping in his ancestral seat, Stigr finally understood what he should have recognized years ago. Brynja was not just his most trusted servant or his most valued advisor. She was his partner in all things, the one person whose courage matched his own, whose loyalty ran deeper than blood itself. Tomorrow would bring Grimver's celebration and the moment of greatest danger they had ever faced. But tonight, for the first time in 3 months of separation, Stigr felt truly home. The hidden cache beneath the stable floor revealed itself, only to those who knew exactly where to press against the worn wooden planks. Stigr's grandfather had been a man who understood that peace was temporary, and the weapons concealed in the secret armory had waited 30 years for such a moment as this. "How did you know?" Brynja whispered as Stigr lifted the concealed panel with practiced ease. "My father showed me when I reached manhood. Every generation learns the locations, one beneath the stable, another under the smokehouse, a third behind the false wall in the grain storage." His hands moved efficiently in the darkness, checking the oil-wrapped weapons by touch alone. He said a wise lord prepares for the day when his hall becomes a battlefield. The cache contained enough arms for 12 men's swords, axes, spear points, and most importantly, several hunting bows with quivers of arrows. Not the weapons of a frontal assault, but the tools of stealth and surprise. "Can you still draw a bow?" Stigr asked, remembering Brynja's occasional hunts with the household women. "Well enough to hit what I aim for, provided the target is not too far or too small." Her smile held grim humor in the pale moonlight filtering through the stable's gaps. They worked in careful silence, selecting weapons and testing their condition. The stable around them held the familiar sense of hay and leather, but also something new, the nervous energy of horses who sensed their owner's tension. Even the animals understood that something fundamental had changed in their small world. "Tell me about their routines," Stigr said as he checked the balance of a hunting spear. "When do they eat? When do they sleep? When do they change the watch?" "They keep poor discipline," Brynja replied. "Ulf sets a loose schedule, but the men follow it carelessly. They drink heavily each evening and sleep late each morning. Only 2 stand watch at any time, one at the main gate, another walking the perimeter. And during the day, most gather in the hall or sit in the courtyard, boasting of their exploits and complaining about the cold. 3 or 4 always remain close to me, supposedly for protection, but really to ensure I don't flee." Stigr nodded thoughtfully. Overconfident enemies made mistakes, but they were also dangerous precisely because they felt secure. A cornered animal fought desperately. A comfortable one might react with startling violence when suddenly threatened. The hidden passages, do any of them know about those? "I don't believe so. Einar mentioned them once in my hearing, saying your grandfather was overly clever in his building. but they laughed and called it the ramblings of an old man. The passage system was indeed cleverly designed. Built during a time when raids were common and survival often depended on quick escape or hidden movement, the tunnels connected key buildings through a network that only family members fully understood. From the stable, one could reach the hall's root cellar, emerge behind the servants' quarters, or even access a hidden exit beyond the compound walls. Tomorrow, when Grimver arrives, I want you to guide them toward the hall's main entrance for the ceremony, Stigr said. Make it seem natural, suggest that proper dignity requires the formal approach, that the bride should welcome her new lord at the threshold. While you move through the passages to position yourself. Exactly. But there's risk in this, Brynja. If they discover me too early, if the plan fails, then we die fighting for a home rather than living as servants in it, she finished quietly. I made that choice when I first warned you to hide. Her courage steadied his own doubts. They were about to attempt something that would seem impossible to most people 2 against 40, with only surprise and determination as their weapons. Yet, looking at her calm expression, Stigr felt the same confidence that had carried him through a dozen successful raids. We'll need a signal, he said. Something that tells me when all the enemies are gathered in one place. Brynja considered this carefully. During the ceremony, I must speak the ritual words accepting Grimver as my lord and husband. I could alter them slightly, include a phrase that warns you while seeming like traditional blessing. What kind of phrase? Instead of may the gods smile upon our union, I could say, may the ravens witness our union. You'll know that all the guests are present and positioned for. A sound from the direction of the hall made them both freeze. Footsteps deliberately placed, moving across the courtyard with purpose, rather than the casual wandering of a restless sleeper. Someone was making rounds, checking the compound with more attention than usual. Stigr carefully lowered the weapons back into their hiding place and eased the panel closed, while Brynja moved to the stable's small window. Through the gap, she could see a figure, silhouetted against the hall's firelight, one of Grimver's warriors making what appeared to be a thorough inspection of the buildings. He's coming this way, she breathed. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft jingle of mail and the scrape of weapon against wood. Whoever approached was fully armed and alert, not the casual wanderer they had hoped. The loft, Stigr whispered, pointing to the ladder that led to the hay storage above their heads. They climbed quickly and quietly, pressing themselves flat among the dried grass as the stable door creaked open below. A shaft of torchlight swept across the floor, illuminating the horses who shifted restlessly at the disturbance. Easy, you beasts, a gruff voice muttered. Nothing here but hay and horseshit. The warrior spent several minutes checking each stall, his torch casting wild shadows on the walls. Once, he paused directly below their hiding place, and Stigr's hand found the hilt of his Sieg's, ready to strike if discovery seemed imminent. But the man was only adjusting his grip on the torch, and after another moment, he moved on to examine the far end of the building. Satisfied? Came another voice from the doorway. Nothing unusual. The woman spoke, truly no sign of the Lord's early return. Ulf worries too much. Stigr the Giant sails the northern waters, chasing fish like a common farmer. He won't return until the spring storms drive him home. Perhaps. But Grimver pays as well to be cautious, and tomorrow decides whether we feast in a new hall or flee like outlaws. The second warrior laughed roughly. Flee? From what? 1 man against 40. Even giants bleed when properly cut. Their voices faded as they moved away, but their words lingered in the loft like a cold wind. Tomorrow would indeed decide everything, and Grimver's men were not quite as complacent as they seemed. Someone this Ulf presumably retained enough wisdom to question their security, even if his concerns were dismissed by others. We'll need to be even more careful. Stigr whispered when the danger had passed completely. And more clever, Brynja added. They expect no resistance, but they're still warriors. When the fighting starts, they'll react quickly. They remained in the loft for another hour, planning every detail of the next day's desperate gamble. The weapons cache would provide the tools they needed. The hidden passages would give them mobility their enemies lacked. And the wedding ceremony would gather all their foes in one place at one time. But success would depend on perfect timing, absolute courage, and the kind of luck that even the gods might hesitate to provide. Against such odds, most people would counsel patience or negotiation or simple flight. Most people, however, had never felt the particular fury that came from watching strangers sleep in their ancestral hall. Dawn brought the sound of horns echoing across the fjord, announcing Grimvir's arrival with all the pomp befitting a jarl claiming new territory. From his concealed position beneath the hall, Stigr listened to the thunder of hoofbeats and the clash of weapons as the wedding party approached his stolen home. The hidden passage that connected the stable to the hall's foundation had been carved from living rock by his grandfather's stonemasons, wide enough for a man to move freely, but narrow enough to defend against intruders. It opened into a chamber directly beneath the main hearth. From here, Stigr could hear every word spoken in the hall above, while remaining completely invisible to those who occupied it. "Welcome, my Lord Grimvir," came Brynja's voice, carefully modulated to suggest nervous anticipation rather than hatred. "Your hall awaits you." "My hall," Grimvir's voice boomed with satisfaction. "The words sound fine, don't they, Elf? Almost as fine as my bride and my lands." Rough laughter followed this pronouncement, along with the scrape of chairs and benches as the newcomers settled themselves. Through gaps in the stone, Stigr could see slivers of the scene above boots and cloak hems, the gleam of weapons, the movement of servants hurrying to accommodate their new masters. "The ceremony should commence immediately," declared a voice he didn't recognize. "The gods favor unions blessed in the morning light." "Patience, priest," Grimvir replied with obvious amusement. "First, let us feast and celebrate what we have accomplished. It's not every day a man gains a hall, a bride, and rich farmlands with so little effort." More laughter, though Stigr detected an undertone of nervousness in some voices. These were experienced warriors. They understood that even the cleverest plan could face unexpected complications. Their celebration carried the forced quality of men trying to convince themselves that victory was already complete. "Where's the woman's guardian?" asked someone. "Should not the hall's eldest servant give her away, as custom demands?" "Old Einar refuses to participate." Ulf's voice carried casual cruelty. "Claims his loyalty belongs to his absent lord. We'll proceed without his blessing. And if Stigr returns to dispute our actions, then he'll find accomplished fact rather than mere intention," Grimvir said coldly. "A wedding witnessed by 40 warriors cannot be easily undone, especially when the bride herself consents to the union." Stigr's jaw clenched at the word consents. They all knew Brynja had no choice in the matter, yet the legal fiction would protect them if challenged by other clans. Everything about this theft had been calculated to appear legitimate, making resistance seem like law-breaking rather than justice. The sounds above shifted as more people entered the hall. Servants moved quickly to serve food and drink, while warriors found places at the long tables. The normal morning activities of a great household continued, but with an underlying tension that spoke to everyone's awareness of what was really taking place. "Bring forth the bride," Grimvir commanded, his voice thick with ale and satisfaction. "Let all present witness her willingness to join our bloodlines." Footsteps crossed the floor above Stigr's head, Brynja moving to stand before the assembled company. He could imagine her expression, carefully composed to hide the revulsion she must feel at this mockery of a sacred ceremony. "I come freely," she said, the words carrying clearly through the stone. I accept Jarl Grimver as my lord and husband, and pledge my service to Clan Bloodaxe." "Well spoken," Grimver approved. "And do you understand what this union means? That all property you managed in Stigr's name now passes to my control?" "I understand, my lord." "Then let the priest speak the binding words, that none may question our lawful claim to these lands." This was Stigr's signal to move. While attention focused on the ceremony above, he slipped through the connecting passage toward the hall's rear entrance. The route took him past the armory chamber where they had stored additional weapons, allowing him to collect a sword and battle axe to complement the long knife at his belt. The passage emerged behind a false wall in what had once been his private chamber. Through the thin wooden partition, he could hear Grimver's voice booming over the assembled crowd. "By Thor's hammer and Odin's wisdom, I claim this woman as my bride and this hall as my seat. Let any who dispute my right speak now, or hold their peace forever." The traditional challenge hung in the air for the required span of heartbeats. In normal circumstances, this was when family members or clan elders would voice any objections to the union. The silence that followed spoke to everyone's understanding that such objections would be met with violence. But as the priest began the final binding words, a new sound cut through the ceremony, the deep, resonant call of a war horn blown from the direction of the fjord. Not Stigr's horn, but one with a different voice, announcing the arrival of yet more visitors to this already crowded day. "Who comes?" Grimver demanded, his voice sharp with sudden concern. Heavy footsteps hurried across the floor as someone moved to the windows. "Ships in the harbor, my lord. 3 of them, flying banners I don't recognize. What colors?" "Blue and silver with a wolf's head device." Stigr's blood ran cold. Those were the colors of Jarl Erik Wolfsbane, a powerful lord from the eastern territories known for his strict interpretation of clan law. If Erik had come to investigate reports of Grimver's activities, the situation had just become infinitely more complex. "How many men?" Grimver asked, no longer bothering to hide his concern. "Difficult to say from here. Perhaps 20, perhaps 30. They're beaching their ships with the confidence of those who expect welcome." The wedding ceremony came to an abrupt halt as Grimver's warriors positioned themselves for potential trouble. Through the wall, Stigr could hear the rapid consultation between the Jarl and his advisors, their voices tense with calculation and growing fear. Could Stigr have sent word to Erik before departing? Someone suggested. "Possible," Ulf replied grimly. "Wolfsbane has been looking for excuse to expand his influence southward. A legal dispute over marriage contracts would serve his purposes well. Then, we complete the ceremony now, before he reaches the hall. Once the binding is finished, Erik cannot challenge what is lawfully done." But even as Grimver spoke these words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats suggested that Erik Wolfsbane was not interested in waiting for their convenience. The wedding that was supposed to complete Grimver's conquest had instead become a race against time, with unexpected guests threatening to transform triumph into disaster. In his hiding place, Stigr smiled grimly. He had not sent word to Erik, but someone clearly had, and the timing could not have been more perfect. The complications multiplying around Grimver's carefully laid plans would provide exactly the chaos needed for a desperate counterattack to succeed. Erik Wolfsbane entered the hall like winter itself, tall, silent, and carrying an aura of barely contained violence. His gray beard was braided with silver wire, and the wolf head brooch at his shoulder caught the firelight as he surveyed the assembled company with eyes like chips of ice. Behind him came 20 of his finest warriors, their hands resting casually on their weapons as they formed a semicircle near the entrance. "Jarl Grimver," Erik said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I trust I have not interrupted anything important?" The question held enough mockery to draw blood, though Erik's expression remained perfectly neutral. Everyone in the hall understood that his arrival at this precise moment was no coincidence. Someone had sent word of Grimvir's activities, and the powerful Jarl had come to investigate personally. "Lord Eric," Grimvir replied, rising from Stigr's stolen high seat with as much dignity as he could muster. "You honor us with your presence. We were just concluding a wedding ceremony. Perhaps you would care to witness the final blessing." "A wedding?" Eric's gaze moved slowly across the scene, taking in the nervous faces of Grimvir's warriors, the hastily arranged ceremony, and most particularly Brynja standing rigid before the makeshift altar. How delightful. "And who, precisely, is being married?" "Myself to this woman Brynja, formerly servant to Stigr Ironhand, but now my lawful bride, as agreed by contract." "Contract?" Eric stepped closer, his warriors moving with him like a pack responding to their alpha's will. How interesting. I was not aware that Stigr had negotiated any such arrangement. When was this agreement made? The hall had gone completely silent. Even the servants had stopped their movements, sensing the deadly currents flowing beneath the surface of this polite conversation. From his hiding place, Stigr could practically taste the fear radiating from Grimvir's men as they realized their carefully constructed lie was about to face examination by someone with the power to expose it. "The details were arranged privately," Grimvir said, his voice growing defensive despite his efforts to maintain control. "Clan business, you understand." "I understand many things," Eric replied pleasantly. "I understand, for instance, that Stigr Ironhand departed on a trading voyage some 3 months ago. I understand that his lands have been unusually well guarded in his absence. And I understand that certain rumors have reached my ears about unauthorized occupation of his holdings." Ulf stepped forward, clearly hoping to support his Jarl through sheer intimidation. "Lord Eric, surely you have not come here to interfere in lawful marriage contracts. Stigr owes my lord a considerable debt, and this woman was offered as surety. Was she indeed?" Eric's attention fixed on Brynja like a hawk spotting prey. "Tell me, woman, did you consent freely to this arrangement?" The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Brynja's answer would either validate Grimvir's claims or expose them as fabrications, but either choice carried mortal danger. If she supported the lie, she would be permanently bound to a man she despised. If she revealed the truth, she might trigger a battle that would destroy everyone she cared about. "I serve the lawful lord of this hall," she said carefully, her voice steady despite the tremor Stigr could hear beneath the words, "as I have always done." Eric smiled, and the expression was like watching winter sunshine, beautiful, but utterly without warmth. How admirably diplomatic. "Yet I notice you did not actually answer my question." "The ceremony is nearly complete," Grimvir interjected desperately. "Perhaps we might finish the blessing, and then discuss any concerns you might have over proper feast." "Oh, but I think my concerns should be addressed immediately," Eric interrupted, his pleasant tone making the words somehow more threatening. "You see, I have it on excellent authority that Stigr Ironhand never made any such contract. Moreover, I have been told that his household was seized by force while he was absent, and that this wedding is nothing more than an elaborate theft disguised as legal proceeding." The accusation struck the hall like a thunderbolt. Grimvir's warriors shifted nervously, hands moving toward their weapons as they realized their position had become untenable. Eric's men responded by subtly adjusting their own stances, creating the unmistakable tension that preceded violence. "Those are serious charges," Grimvir said, abandoning all pretense of courtesy. "I hope you can substantiate them." "Can you substantiate your own claims?" Eric countered. "Show me this contract. Produce witnesses to its negotiation. Bring forth the elders who blessed this arrangement according to proper custom." The contract was verbal, witnessed only by the parties involved. How convenient. And these parties, where might they be found? "Stigr sails the northern waters." "Does he indeed?" Eric's smile widened, revealing teeth like old ivory. Then, perhaps you would be surprised to learn that my own ships encountered his vessels just yesterday, returning from what appeared to be a most successful trading expedition. He should arrive. Eric glanced toward the windows as if calculating time. Within the hour, I would estimate. The blood drained from Grimber's face as the implications struck home. Not only was his legal fiction about to be exposed, but the man he had sought to dispossess was about to arrive with his full war band. Worse, Eric's presence meant that any violence would be witnessed by one of the most powerful Jarls in the region. Surely there has been some misunderstanding, Grimber began. Oh, I suspect the understanding is quite clear, Eric replied. The question is what should be done about it. In the terrible silence that followed, Stigr made his decision. The arrival of Eric Wolfsbane had changed everything, creating an opportunity he had never dared hope for. Instead of a desperate two-person assault against impossible odds, he now had the chance to expose Grimber's crimes before a witness, whose word could not be questioned, moving carefully through the hidden passage. He made his way toward the hall's main entrance. The time for stealth had passed. Now was the moment for dramatic revelation. For justice delivered in full view of those with the power to enforce it behind him. He could hear Eric's voice continuing the methodical destruction of Grimber's position. Tell me, woman, where do you suppose your true lord might be found when he returns to discover strangers occupying his hall? I imagine, Brynja said with the first hint of steel her voice had shown all morning, that he would be most displeased. Displeased, Eric mused. Yes, I imagine that is exactly what he would be. As Stigr reached the passage's end, preparing to emerge into the morning light and reclaim everything that was rightfully his, he could not help but smile. Grimber had planned this day as his moment of triumph, but it was rapidly becoming something quite different indeed. The hall's great doors swung open with the slow deliberation of fate itself. Stigr stood silhouetted against the morning light, his massive frame filling the entrance like an avenging god returned to reclaim his domain. Behind him, the empty courtyard stretched toward the fjord where his ships waited, their dragon prows testament to successful months and silence that greeted his appearance was so complete that even the fire seemed to pause in its crackling. 40 armed men sat frozen in tableau, their faces reflecting the shock of seeing a dead man walk. For Grimber had told them Stigr would not return for months, yet here he stood in flesh and blood, very much alive and clearly displeased with what he found in his ancestral hall. How curious, Eric Wolfsbane observed with obvious satisfaction. It seems your absent host has returned rather earlier than expected. Stigr's gray eyes swept across the assembled company, cataloging faces and positions with the practiced efficiency of a warrior assessing battlefield conditions. His gaze lingered on Grimber slouching in the high seat like a usurper caught in the act, then moved to Ulf and the other champions whose confidence had evaporated at his appearance. Finally, his eyes found Brynja standing rigid before the makeshift altar, still wearing the silver brooch that marked her true allegiance. The relief that flickered across her features was quickly suppressed, but not before Stigr caught the flash of emotion that spoke to her ordeal over the past days. Lord Grimber, Stigr said, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder. I understand congratulations are in order. A wedding, I'm told. Stigr, Grimber managed, struggling to his feet with far less grace than he had shown entering the hall. We did not expect your return so soon, clearly. Stigr stepped into the hall with measured paces, each footfall deliberate as a drumbeat. I trust you have been comfortable in my absence? The question carried enough menace to make seasoned warriors shift nervously in their seats. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing the opening moves of a confrontation that could end in blood. Yet none dared interrupt the deadly courtesy being exchanged. Your household has been most gracious, Grimber replied, attempting to regain his composure. In fact, we were just formalizing certain arrangements. Arrangements? Stigr's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. How thoughtful of you to take such interest in my affairs. Perhaps you could explain these arrangements to me? Eric Wolfsbane leaned back in his borrowed seat, clearly enjoying the performance. His warriors remained alert but relaxed, content to watch their host dismantle his enemy through words rather than steel. This was legal theater at its finest, with life and death hanging in the balance of each carefully chosen phrase. There was a debt, Grimver said desperately. A contract made before your departure. A debt? Stigr's voice rose slightly, carrying just enough volume to ensure every word reached the far corners of the hall. To you? I confess myself puzzled, Lord Grimver. My memory of our last meeting recalls no mention of debt. The details were complex. Were they indeed? Then perhaps you could refresh my memory with specifics. What service did I require that obligated me to you? What goods did you provide that created such obligation? Each question struck like a sword thrust, precise and devastating. Grimver's attempts at explanation crumbled under the weight of simple logic, while his warriors began to understand that their legal justification was evaporating before their eyes. The woman agreed. Ulf interjected, trying to support his failing yaw. Did she? Stigr's attention fixed on his champion like a hawk focusing on prey. How interesting that my household servants should negotiate contracts without my knowledge or consent. Tell me, Ulf Ironhand, under what authority does a servant dispose of her master's property? She acted as your agent. Did I appoint her such? Did I grant her power to make binding agreements in my name? Stigr's voice remained level, but the threat beneath grew more apparent with each word. Or perhaps you suggest she acted independently, disposing of what was never hers to give. The logic was inescapable, and even Grimver's most loyal supporters could see their position collapsing. They had entered this hall as conquerors claiming legal right, but now stood revealed as common thieves caught in the act of stealing. There has been some misunderstanding, Grimver said weakly. Indeed there has, Eric agreed pleasantly, though I suspect the misunderstanding has been entirely deliberate. Stigr moved closer to the high seat, each step forcing Grimver to decide whether to stand his ground or retreat. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present, the rightful lord reclaiming his place while the usurper faced the choice of flight or fight. I find myself curious about many things. Stigr continued conversationally. The comfort with which you occupy my chair, for instance. The familiarity with which your men treat my hall. The assumption that my property stands available for your disposal. We meant no offense. No offense? Stigr's laugh was like breaking ice. You invade my lands, terrorize my household, and attempt to steal my property through fabricated contracts, yet claim no offense was intended? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Grimver's warriors began glancing toward the exits, calculating distances and weighing their chances of escape against the growing certainty that their expedition had become a disaster. Perhaps, Eric suggested mildly, this matter might be resolved through proper legal proceedings. A formal hearing before neutral arbiters, with testimony from all relevant witnesses. An excellent suggestion, Stigr agreed, though I confess myself eager to hear Lord Grimver's explanation for the Iron Raven standard planted in my courtyard. Such symbols typically mark permanent conquest rather than temporary visit. The mention of the standard sent a visible shudder through Grimver's remaining supporters. The physical evidence of their intent to claim the territory could not be explained away as misunderstanding or peaceful negotiation. The standard can be removed, someone suggested. Desperately. Can it indeed? Stigr's smile was like winter sunlight on blade steel. How remarkably convenient. Yet I wonder what other evidence of peaceful intent might require similar removal. His meaning was clear to everyone present. The occupation of the hall, the forced wedding ceremony, The imprisonment of his loyal retainers all spoke to deliberate conquest rather than lawful contract. Grimvir's carefully constructed fiction had crumbled under the simple expedient of asking direct questions in front of credible witnesses. "Lord Eric," Stigr said formally, "I place this matter before you as neutral arbiter. Does what you have witnessed here suggest lawful proceedings or criminal action?" Eric's smile was sharp as a blade. "Most illuminating indeed." Eric Wolfsbane rose from his seat with the fluid grace of a predator finally ready to strike. His gray eyes swept the assembled company once more, but when he spoke, his words shattered every assumption about the morning's events. "Stigr Ironhand," he said with formal precision, "I arrest you for the murder of my nephew, Harald Eriksson, and the theft of tribute gold rightfully belonging to my clan." The accusation struck the hall like a bolt of lightning. Grimvir's warriors, who had been preparing for defeat and disgrace, suddenly straightened with renewed hope, while Stigr himself went rigid with shock at the completely unexpected charge. "What?" Stigr's voice carried genuine bewilderment. "Harald is dead?" "Do not feign ignorance," Eric replied coldly. "My nephew sailed with you on this latest expedition, as witness and tribute collector for the eastern clans. He was to ensure proper division of spoils according to our agreements. Yet he did not return with your ships, and the tribute gold he carried has mysteriously vanished." The pieces of Eric's real purpose began falling into place with sickening clarity. His arrival had not been to investigate Grimvir's activities. It had been to trap Stigr upon his return. The legal maneuvering, the careful questions, the theatrical exposure of Grimvir's crimes, all had been designed to lull Stigr into a false sense of security before springing this devastating surprise. Harald chose to remain in Saxon lands, Stigr said carefully, his mind racing to understand how his young friend's decision had been twisted into this accusation. He found opportunity for profitable trading and asked to be released from his obligations to your service. "How convenient." Eric's smile was like ice forming over deep water. "And I suppose you have witnesses to this remarkable conversation?" The crew heard. "Your crew. Your men. Your loyal followers who would swear to any story you provided them." Eric's voice carried the confidence of someone who had planned this confrontation down to the smallest detail. "How unfortunate that the one neutral witness is no longer available to confirm your version of events." Brynja stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "Lord Eric, if I may speak?" "You may not," Eric replied without even glancing at her. "This matter concerns the honor and justice between Jarls, not the testimony of servants." But Brynja had not spent days listening to Grimvir's men without learning something valuable. "I understand that, my lord, but perhaps you would be interested to know that Harald Eriksson returned to this hall not 3 days ago, very much alive and carrying a substantial amount of silver." The silence that followed her words was absolute. Eric's face went pale as the implication struck home, while Grimvir's expression shifted from relief to horrified understanding. If Harald was alive and had returned independently, it meant Eric's entire case was built on false premises or deliberate lies. "That is impossible," Eric said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice for the first time. "Is it?" Stigr's own confusion was clearing as he began to understand what had really happened. "Harald, show yourself. I know you are listening." A moment passed, then another. Finally, from behind the tapestry that concealed the hall's side entrance, a young man emerged with obvious reluctance. Harald Eriksson was tall and lean like his uncle, but where Eric radiated controlled menace, Harald carried himself with the nervous energy of someone caught in a web he had helped weave. "Uncle," Harald said quietly, unable to meet Eric's eyes, "I can explain. Can you indeed?" Eric's voice was like winter wind through bare branches. "Then perhaps you can explain how you are alive when I received word of your death, along with proof of your murder." Harald's face flushed red with shame and growing fear. "I sent those messages myself." I needed you to believe I was dead so that I could—" His words trailed off as he realized how much he was revealing. "So that you could what?" Stigr demanded, pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a picture he didn't like. "So that he could steal the tribute gold for himself," Grimver said, with sudden understanding and growing satisfaction. "The boy played us all false. He convinced his uncle that you had murdered him, then returned here to collect his share of the profits while avoiding any obligation to divide them properly." The accusation hung in the air like poison smoke. Harold's silence confirmed its truth more effectively than any denial could have. The young man had indeed sent false word of his own death, keeping the tribute gold for himself while allowing his uncle to believe Stigr was a murderer. "But there's more, isn't there, boy?" Eric's voice carried the terrible quiet of absolute fury. "You didn't just steal gold and let your family believe you dead. You also provided someone with very specific information about Stigr's return, didn't you?" Harold's terrified nod confirmed what everyone was beginning to suspect. The young man had not just robbed his own family, he had sold information to Grimver about Stigr's movements, enabling the invasion of the Hall and the attempted theft of the lands. "You told Grimver exactly when I would return," Stigr said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "You arranged for him to be here, ready to claim my property through this false marriage contract." "I needed the money," Harold whispered desperately. "The tribute gold wasn't enough to pay my debts. Grimver offered me silver for information. And you thought to make yourself rich by betraying everyone who trusted you," Eric finished, his voice containing enough menace to freeze blood in winter veins. "You let your family mourn your supposed death while you conspired with our enemies to steal from our allies." The revelation transformed the entire situation yet again. What had seemed like Grimver's simple theft had actually been an elaborate conspiracy involving Eric's own nephew. The wedding ceremony, the legal maneuvering, even Eric's perfectly timed arrival, all had been orchestrated to create a situation where multiple crimes could be committed simultaneously. "The gold," Stigr said with growing certainty. "It's still here, isn't it? That's why you're all so confident about holding this hall. You're not just stealing my lands, you're using them as a base for storing your stolen wealth." Grimver's expression confirmed the accuracy of this deduction. The attempted conquest had never been just about acquiring territory. It had been about creating a secure location where Harold's theft could be concealed, and where the profits from various crimes could be safely divided among the conspirators. "Where?" Eric demanded, his fury now focused entirely on his traitorous nephew. "The grain storage," Harold mumbled, realizing that confession was his only hope of surviving his uncle's wrath. "Buried beneath the false floor." The admission sealed everyone's fate. Eric's rage at his nephew's betrayal, Grimver's exposure as a conspirator in grand theft, Harold's confession to multiple serious crimes, all combined to create a situation where violence was no longer a possibility but an inevitability. "Well," Stigr said with grim satisfaction, "this certainly explains why everyone was so eager to claim my property. Hard to spend stolen gold when you have nowhere safe to store it." The truth was finally revealed in all its ugly complexity, and every person in the hall understood that the morning's events had been manipulated by a conspiracy that went far deeper than simple territorial ambition. What happened next would depend on who drew steel first, and who proved fastest when the inevitable bloodshed began. The tension in the hall stretched taut as a bowstring, every warrior present understanding that words had reached their limit, and steel would soon settle what diplomacy could not. Eric's hand moved slowly to his sword hilt, while Grimver's men shifted positions with the subtle efficiency of fighters preparing for battle in close quarters. "Before we spill blood on these ancient stones," Stigr said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, "perhaps we should consider what justice actually requires here." Eric's gray eyes remained fixed on his nephew, but his attention clearly remained on Stigr's words. Justice requires blood payment for theft and betrayal. The only question is whose blood will flow. Agreed. Stigr nodded slowly. But let us be clear about the crimes we're addressing. Harold stole from you and lied to his family. Those are matters between your clan and his conscience. Grimver invaded my lands and attempted theft through false marriage that touches my honor directly. Grimver's champion, Ulf, stepped forward with obvious aggressive intent. Your honor means nothing here, Stigr. You stand alone against 40 armed men. Submit to Lord Eric's judgment, and perhaps some of your household will survive what follows. The threat was clear enough, but Stigr's response was a low chuckle that somehow managed to sound more dangerous than any shout of rage. Alone? Did you think I returned from 3 months of successful raiding with only my own sword for protection? As if summoned by his words, the great doors swung wide to admit a stream of armed warriors. Thorvald entered first, his battle axe gleaming with fresh oil, followed by 20 of Stigr's most experienced fighters. Their mail shirts bore the marks of recent travel, but their weapons were ready, and their formation spoke of men prepared for immediate action. My lord, Thorvald announced with grim satisfaction, we've secured the perimeter as you ordered. No one leaves this hall without your permission. The odds had shifted dramatically, but not decisively. 40 men still faced roughly 30, though Stigr's warriors had the advantage of position and preparation. More importantly, they fought for their own homes while their enemies were, raiders far from friendly territory. Eric assessed the new situation with the cool calculation of a veteran commander. Well played, Stigr, though you realize this changes nothing regarding my nephew's crimes. It changes everything regarding how those crimes are addressed, Stigr replied firmly. Harold will face justice, but it will be justice determined by proper trial, not summary execution in my hall. And Grimver's crimes? Eric asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity about how Stigr intended to resolve the complex web of betrayals they had uncovered. Also subject to trial, though I confess myself inclined toward immediate satisfaction for the insult to my household. Brynja moved quietly closer to the wall, where weapons hung in easy reach, her positioning both protective and strategic. The silver brooch at her throat caught the firelight as she tracked the movements of potential threats, ready to act if violence erupted despite the careful negotiations. There is another way, she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the key participants. A way that honors all legitimate grievances while avoiding the waste of good men's lives. Eric turned his attention to her with obvious skepticism. You would presume to suggest solutions to matters involving clan honor. I would presume to suggest that dead warriors serve no one's honor, she replied with quiet dignity. And that wise lords consider all options before choosing the path that leads to the most blood. Her words carried a weight that transcended her official status as servant. Everyone present had witnessed her courage over the past days, her intelligence in managing complex deceptions, and her loyalty in the face of genuine danger. Even Eric seemed to recognize that dismissing her counsel might be unwise. Speak then, Stigr said formally. What solution do you see that preserves honor while preventing unnecessary slaughter? Single combat, she said simply. Let champions fight for each side, with the outcome determining justice for all parties. Harold's fate, Grimver's punishment, the disposition of stolen gold, all decided by trial of arms between chosen representatives. The suggestion sparked immediate discussion among the assembled warriors. Single combat was an ancient and honored method of resolving disputes, particularly when multiple claims of justice created complex legal tangles. It offered a way to settle everything definitively while limiting bloodshed to 2 men instead of 60. Who would serve as champions? Eric asked, his strategic mind already working through the implications. For your side, any warrior you choose, Stigr replied. For mine, I claim that right myself. Ulf stepped forward eagerly, clearly hoping to be selected for the honor of facing the legendary Stigr in formal combat. "My Lord Eric, I request the privilege of representing our cause. I have awaited such an opportunity for years." Eric studied his would-be champion thoughtfully, weighing Ulf's acknowledged skill against the reputation of his opponent. "Stigr Ironhand has defeated many good men in single combat. Are you certain you wish to stake everything on your ability to overcome him?" "I am certain of my skill and the righteousness of our cause," Ulf replied with the confidence of a man who had never faced truly superior opposition. "Then it seems we have our combatants," Stigr observed. "Though I would suggest certain conditions to ensure fairness and finality." "Name them," Eric said. "First, that the combat be to the death, with no quarter asked or given. Second, that the winner's side gains complete authority over all disputed matters: the gold, the land claims, the punishment of the guilty. Third, that all warriors present swear by their own honor to accept the outcome without further violence." These were harsh terms, but they offered the certainty that everyone sought. No ambiguous results, no lingering disputes, no possibility of renewed conflict when the immediate crisis passed. Everything would be settled by the skill and courage of two men fighting for causes larger than themselves. "Agreed," Eric said after a moment's consideration. "Though I would add one condition of my own, that the combat take place immediately, before anyone has opportunity to reconsider or attempt escape." "Also agreed," Stigr nodded. "The courtyard provides adequate space, and the morning light will serve for proper witness." As the two groups filed out of the hall toward the designated combat area, Brynja found herself walking beside Stigr. Her composed expression could not entirely hide the concern in her eyes, though she was careful not to voice doubts that might weaken his resolve. "You realize," she said quietly, "that Ulf is younger than you and has trained for exactly this sort of combat his entire life?" "I realize many things," Stigr replied with a slight smile. "I realize that he has never faced an opponent who fights for his home and his people. I realize that his confidence comes from victories over men who had something to lose by killing him. Most importantly, I realize that you have given me more reason to survive this day than I have ever had before." A breath caught at the implications of his words, but before she could respond, they emerged into the cold morning air where the combat would take place. The courtyard had been cleared, with warriors from both sides forming a rough circle around the designated fighting space dot at the center of the ring. Grimvir's iron raven standard still stood thrust into the earth where his men had planted it days earlier. The sight of it sent a surge of anger through Stigr's chest soon, one way or another. That symbol of theft and betrayal would be removed forever. Ulf was already checking his weapons and testing the footing, his movements displaying the fluid confidence of a man who had never doubted his own superiority. He was indeed younger than Stigr by perhaps 15 years, with the lean build and quick reflexes of a natural fighter. But as Stigr drew his own sword and felt its familiar weight settle into his hand, he reflected on all the battles that had brought him to this moment. He had fought Saxon warriors defending their own shores, rival raiders competing for the same prize, and wild Northmen whose only law was the strength of their sword arms. Today, however, he fought for something more precious than gold or glory. He fought for the right to call his ancestral hall his own, for the safety of those who had served his family faithfully, and for the future he had only now begun to envision, a future that included the remarkable woman who had risked everything to protect his home in his absence. The time for words had passed completely. Steel would provide the only argument that mattered. Now, the morning air bit sharp as steel as the two champions faced each other across the packed earth of the courtyard. Ulf moved with the eager confidence of a wolf closing on wounded prey, his sword-cutting practice patterns through the air while his eyes never left Stigr's massive frame. "Are you ready to die, old man?" Ulf called out, his voice carrying across the silent circle of witnesses. "Your raiding days are finished, and your lands will have a new master before this day ends." Stigr did not respond with words. Instead, he rolled his shoulders slowly, testing the weight of his mail shirt and the freedom of movement in his sword arm. The weapon in his hand was not the ornate blade of ceremony, but the plain steel tool that had served him through 100 battles nicked from hard use. But sharp as winter's bite, Eric raised his hand to signal the beginning of combat. Let the gods judge between truth and falsehood, between justice and theft. Let them grant victory to the righteous cause. The hand fell like an executioner's axe, and instantly both warriors were in motion. Ulf attacked with the lightning speed of youth, his blade flashing in a high cut designed to split Stigr's skull before the older man could react. But Stigr had faced too many eager young warriors to be surprised by such tactics. He swayed aside just enough for the blow to pass harmlessly through empty air, then riposted with a thrust that forced Ulf to leap backward, or lose his throat. The exchange established a pattern that would define their combat. Ulf possessed youth, speed, and technique polished through years of training with the finest weapon masters. Stigr brought experience, cunning, and the terrible patience of a man who understood that battles were won not by brilliance, but by surviving long enough to exploit his enemy's inevitable mistake. They circled each other warily, steel ringing against steel as they tested distances and reflexes. Ulf's attacks came in flowing combinations, each strike flowing seamlessly into the next. But Stigr's defense was like a boulder enduring a storm, immovable, implacable, wearing down his opponent's strength through sheer persistence. "Stand still and fight." Ulf snarled as another assault was turned aside with minimal effort. "I am fighting," Stigr replied calmly, his breathing still controlled despite the exertion. "You are performing." The distinction stung because it was accurate. Ulf fought with the flashy technique of tournament combat, designed to impress observers and demonstrate skill. Stigr fought with the brutal efficiency of a man who had learned his lessons in places where defeat meant death rather than mere embarrassment. When Ulf committed to a particularly elaborate attack sequence, Stigr finally showed him the difference. Instead of merely defending, the older warrior suddenly stepped inside his opponent's guard, trapped the younger man's sword arm against his body, and drove his pommel toward Ulf's temple in a blow that would have ended the fight permanently. Only, Ulf's desperate backward fall saved his life, though the impact still opened a gash above his left eye that sent blood streaming down his face. He rolled away frantically as Stigr's follow-up strike split the earth where his head had been moments before. "First blood to the old man," someone called from the watching circle. Though whether in mockery or admiration, was impossible to determine. Ulf wiped blood from his eyes and reassessed his opponent with new respect. The easy victory he had expected was clearly not going to materialize. Stigr was too experienced, too patient, too willing to endure lesser attacks while waiting for the opportunity to land a decisive blow. But youth had advantages beyond speed and strength. Ulf's wound was painful, but not debilitating, while every exchange demanded more from Stigr's aging body. If the fight continued long enough, exhaustion would accomplish what skill could not. The younger warrior changed tactics, abandoning his attempts at quick victory in favor of a war of attrition. He began circling constantly, forcing Stigr to turn and pivot, using his superior mobility to strike from unexpected angles while avoiding prolonged exchanges that favored his opponent's experience. The strategy was sound, and Stigr recognized it for what it was, an attempt to transform single combat into a race against time. Already his sword felt heavier than it had at the start, and his mail shirt seemed to constrict, his breathing more with each passing moment. Yet experience had taught him that youth's greatest weakness was its impatience. Ulf might be willing to adopt a defensive strategy, but his nature would eventually demand more direct action. The key was surviving long enough for that impatience to manifest as opportunity. Around them, The circle of warriors watched in tense silence as two different philosophies of combat tested themselves against each other. Some fights were decided in moments by superior skill or fortunate accident. Others became contests of will and endurance, where victory belonged not to the strongest or fastest, but to the one who refused to yield when his body demanded surrender. This was becoming the second kind of fight, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing something special, a battle that would be remembered and retold for years to come. Regardless of its outcome, the moment Stigr had been waiting for came when Ulf's patience finally cracked. The younger warrior, frustrated by his inability to land a decisive blow against his methodical opponent, abandoned caution in favor of a devastating overhead strike designed to cleave through mail and bone alike. It was exactly the sort of committed attack that left no room for recovery. Either it succeeded completely, or it left the attacker fatally exposed. Stigr had seen the telltale signs in Ulf's stance, the subtle shift of weight that preceded such an assault, and he was ready. Instead of retreating or attempting to block the massive blow, Stigr stepped forward into the attack's path. Ulf's sword whistled down with killing force, but struck only the place where Stigr had been standing a heartbeat earlier. The older warrior had moved inside the arc of the blow, too close for the blade to reach him. And suddenly, Ulf found himself face to face with a man whose eyes held the cold certainty of death. Stigr's counterattack was brutally simple as straight thrust that punched through mail rings and buried 3 inches of steel in Ulf's chest, just below the ribs. The younger man's eyes went wide with shock and disbelief as he felt his strength drain away like water through cracked stone. "How?" Ulf gasped, blood frothing at his lips as his legs betrayed him and he sank to his knees. "Experience," Stigr replied quietly, withdrawing his blade with a wet sound that seemed to echo across the suddenly silent courtyard. "You fought for glory and gold. I fought for home." Ulf toppled forward onto his face, his lifeblood soaking into the earth of a courtyard he had tried to claim through treachery and force. The Iron Raven standard stood over his body like a monument to the futility of ambition. Unchecked by wisdom, Eric Wolfsbane stepped forward, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the outcome of the trial by combat. "The gods have spoken," he announced formally. "Victory belongs to Stigr Ironhand, and justice is his to dispense." But before Stigr could respond, Harold suddenly broke from the circle of watchers and sprinted toward the hall. The young man had clearly decided that the outcome of the combat released him from any obligation to face his uncle's justice, and flight was preferable to the uncertain mercy of either victor. He made it, perhaps, 20 paces before Brynja stepped into his path, a hunting bow drawn and aimed at his chest. The arrow was nocked and ready, her stance as steady as if she were targeting a deer rather than a desperate young man. "Stop," she commanded, her voice carrying absolute authority. "Your crimes require answering, and running will only make your punishment worse." Harold skidded to a halt, his face pale with terror as he realized that escape was impossible. Around the courtyard, warriors from both sides watched the tableau with fascination. The servant woman holding a Jarl's nephew at arrow point was a sight none of them had expected to witness. "Please," Harold begged, his voice cracking with fear. "I never meant for anyone to die. I just needed the gold to pay my debts, and then everything got out of control." "That may be true," Stigr said, walking slowly toward the frightened young man while cleaning blood from his sword. "But intentions matter less than actions, and your actions brought thieves and murderers into my hall." Eric approached his nephew with the measured pace of a judge delivering sentence. The powerful Jarl's face showed neither mercy nor particular cruelty, only the cold impartiality of someone weighing a life against the demands of justice. "The gold," Eric said simply. "Where is it hidden?" "Beneath the grain storage," Harold whispered. "There's a false floor. The bags are buried under the planking." "All of it?" Most of it. Some was used to pay Grimvir's men, but the majority remains untouched. Eric nodded slowly, then turned to address Stigr directly. The combat has established your right to determine my nephew's fate. What justice do you demand? It was a moment that would define not just Harold's future, but the relationship between two powerful clans. Too harsh a punishment might create lasting enmity with the Wolfsbane family, while excessive mercy could be seen as weakness that invited future challenges. Exile, Stigr decided after a long moment of consideration. Harold Eriksson forfeits all claim to inheritance or family protection. He has one day to gather his personal belongings and depart this territory, never to return upon pain of death. The sentence struck Harold like a physical blow. Exile was often considered worse than execution, condemning him to a life of wandering without clan protection or family support. Yet it was also merciful enough to preserve his life and offer the possibility of redemption in distant lands. Fair judgment, Eric acknowledged with obvious relief. A harsher sentence might have required him to seek blood vengeance despite his nephew's guilt, creating conflicts that would benefit no one. And Grimvir? Brynja asked, still maintaining her ready stance with the bow. Stigr looked at the man who had attempted to steal everything he valued. The Jarl knelt in the dirt beside his fallen champion, his schemes in ruins and his future entirely dependent on the mercy of the man he had tried to destroy. That, Stigr said grimly, requires more careful consideration. 3 days after the combat, the Great Hall had been restored to proper order. The Iron Raven standard lay broken in the courtyard, its pieces destined for the forge, where they would be melted down and reformed into something useful rather than threatening. Grimvir's surviving warriors had departed with their disgraced lord, carrying with them the knowledge that attempted theft through treachery carried consequences that extended far beyond simple failure. Stigr stood before the carved wooden altar where the statues of the gods watched over his family's fortune, but his attention was focused on the woman beside him rather than the divine protectors above. Brynja wore a gown of deep blue wool rather than her usual servant's dress, and the silver brooch at her throat caught the firelight as she turned to meet his gaze. "Are you certain about this?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying undertones of wonder mixed with lingering disbelief. "I have never been more certain of anything," he replied, taking her hands in his own. "These past days have shown me truths I should have recognized years ago. You are not my servant, Brynja. You never were. You are my partner in all things, the keeper of my heart as well as my hall." The formal ceremony that followed was small compared to the grand celebrations that usually marked noble marriages, but it carried a weight of genuine emotion that no amount of pomp could have matched. Old Einar, finally restored to his proper place as head of the household staff, spoke the traditional words with tears of joy gleaming in his weathered eyes. Young Carrie wept openly as she scattered flower petals, her romantic heart delighted by the union she had long hoped to witness. Eric Wolfsbane served as witness to the proceedings, his presence lending political weight to what might otherwise have been dismissed as a mere convenience. The powerful Jarl had elected to remain for several days, ostensibly to ensure proper transfer of the recovered tribute gold, but actually to negotiate agreements that would benefit both their territories. A wise match, Eric observed as the couple exchanged rings before the assembled household. Political alliances are useful, but marriages built on genuine respect and shared trials tend to endure longer. When the ceremony concluded, the celebration that followed carried the warmth of a community reunited after facing genuine danger together. The servants who had endured days of uncertainty under hostile occupation rejoiced in the restoration of familiar order, while Stigr's warriors shared tales of their successful raiding season and the dramatic return that had saved their lord's holdings. As the evening progressed and the ale flowed freely, Stigr found himself reflecting on the strange turns of fate that had brought him to this moment. 3 months earlier, he had departed on what seemed like a routine trading expedition, leaving behind a household servant whose feelings he had never dared acknowledge. He returned to find that same woman transformed into the defender of his domain and the keeper of his heart. "What will you do with Grimvir's lands?" Brynja asked as they sat together at the high table, watching their people celebrate around them. "Leave them for the ravens, most likely," Stigr replied with a shrug. "His surviving family can fight over the inheritance or let neighboring jarls divide the territory among themselves. I have no interest in governing lands obtained to another man's dishonor." It was a decision that spoke to his character he could easily have. Claimed Grimvir's holdings as compensation for the attempted theft, but such action would have made him little better than the man he had defeated. Justice had been served by exposure and exile. Greed had no place in its aftermath. And Harold? She asked, though they both knew the young man had already vanished into the wilderness beyond their borders. "Will live or die according to his own choices," Stigr said with finality. "Exile offers the possibility of redemption, but only if he chooses to learn from his mistakes, rather than repeat them." The recovered gold had indeed been substantial enough to finance several seasons of comfortable living or one truly magnificent raiding expedition. But Stigr had already decided that his days of distant voyages were finished. The responsibilities of marriage and household management would keep him closer to home, focusing on the prosperity of his own lands rather than the acquisition of wealth from foreign shores. "Do you regret it?" Brynja asked, understanding his thoughts with the intuitive connection that had grown between them. "The end of your raiding days, I mean. How could I regret gaining something more valuable than all the gold in Saxon England?" He replied, raising his cup in a toast to the woman who had risked everything to preserve his home dot as the celebration continued around them. Husband and wife shared the quiet satisfaction of people who had faced the worst that fate could offer and emerged stronger for the experience. The trials that had brought them together had also proven their ability to meet any future challenge as partners rather than individuals struggling alone. Outside the hall, winter was settling over the fjords with the promise of long nights and short days ahead. But inside, warmth and light drove back the darkness, just as love and loyalty had triumphed over greed and treachery. The silver brooch at Brynja's throat, the family heirloom that had survived, the loss of lands and status now gleamed in its proper place beside the symbols of her new rank. Some stories end with the clash of steel and the fall of enemies. Others conclude with the quieter victory of two people finding in each other the completion they had always sought. In the great hall of Vargheim, as the fire settled into glowing coals and the celebration gradually gave way to contented silence, Stigr and Brynja began the greatest adventure of their lives together. The ravens that had gathered so ominously weeks before had dispersed with the coming of winter, their purpose fulfilled and their warnings heeded. In their place, only the carved wooden birds on the hall's roof remained, eternal guardians watching over a household where loyalty had proven stronger than gold, and love had triumphed over the schemes of ambitious men.